All right, well, welcome back. So here we are at 4.3, and so hopefully you had a chance to take a look at that video, that YouTube video. So still working on photosynthesis. So let's see. Leaves of many deciduous trees change color in the fall. All right, let's just move on to plants and as far as their mass. So here's an interesting thing that, when photosynthesis was being discovered and scientists were working out the details of it, the question became, where does all the carbon that a plant uses to build its structure, like this tree right here, where does all of the material, the carbon that it's made out of, where does that come from? And so the first thought was that, well, it's probably in the soil, and it gets transported up through the vascular tissue, through the root system, up towards the leaves. And so scientists worked out that and they measured, the weight, the mass of soil, and allowed a plant to grow in it. And when the plant was done growing, the mass of the soil was still exactly the same. So we know that the carbon is not actually coming from the soil. So then the scientists started looking towards it being carbon from out in the atmosphere, which is what you and I know, is that it's carbon dioxide that's in carbon in the form of carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere that is being used. The water does come from the soil. They produce the sugar. Here's that carbon biomass that we're talking about. And I said, where does all that carbon in their structures, come from? Here it is. It's in the form of sugar. Plants use that sugar to build all of their structures with. Okay, so when it comes to photosynthesis, it occurs in two stages. The first stage, or stage number one, is called the light reaction stage, and some people refer to it as light-dependent photosynthesis because this is the part of photosynthesis. It's completely dependent on light. It'll only happen if the lights are on, and that's where the plants are capturing sunlight's energy. And what they do is they store it in the form of ATP. So they're making ATP right from sunlight's energy. They then turn around and use that ATP in order to build sugar. So they're not going to use this ATP that they're making in photosynthesis. They're not going to use that to grow. They're not going to use it to produce pretty flowers. They're going to use it to build sugar. And if they need energy for growing and to produce beautiful flowers, they will use the sugar molecule that they just built, and they'll break it down through cellular respiration to get ATP out of it again. So, but photosynthesis is broken up into two reactions: the light reactions, or light-dependent phases of photosynthesis, and then the Calvin cycle. And the Calvin cycle, some people call it light-independent phase, because the Calvin cycle doesn't need light in order to occur. All it needs is the ATP that was made during the light reaction, and it will use that ATP to build the sugar. So the light reaction, here are the things that are important in regards to the light reaction. One, here's where the energy is coming in, and again, it goes through the chloroplast membrane into the thylakoids. This is where the chlorophyll is actually located, is inside the chlorophyll. And so the chlorophyll will be splitting the water molecules. And again, remember, it's taking the hydrogens off of the water, and in doing that, it produces oxygen. So the oxygen you and I breathe was produced in this first phase, the light reactions. In doing so, it produces ATP. Those hydrogens that it steals off of the water are then come out of the thylakoid, or they come out of this structure, out into the surrounding structure called the stroma, where they'll come in contact with the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle takes the carbon dioxide, so this is there's an enzyme right here located in the stroma of the plants. So that space in the chloroplast called the stroma. Inside there's an enzyme called rubisco, and rubisco takes the carbon dioxide and starts joining them together. And while it's joining them together, it adds on those hydrogens onto it. So the hydrogens that were removed from the water by this structure, the thylakoid, go out into the stroma, where they are then built onto the sugar. And that process out there, which is independent of light, doesn't care. I don't need light for CO2. I don't need light for those hydrogens. I've already got them. As long as the light was on at some point and I've got those hydrogens right now, all I'm doing is building sugar. And plants can do that in the dark. They can do it in the light. Doesn't really matter. It's independent of light, meaning it can happen in the light, can happen in the dark. But this cycle is called the Calvin cycle, and it happens in the stroma. And that's how sugar is basically built. So you've got the light reactions. Those are the hydrogens right there. Okay, so when they come out of the stroma, they get picked up by this molecule. It's called NADPH. It's NADP, this guy right here. NADP is kind of like a taxi cab. And it picks up, it comes over to the thylakoids, picks up the hydrogens, carries it over to the Calvin cycle, drops it off, goes back, picks up another one. We've seen this kind of model a few times already this semester. So this is called an electron carrier. It's shuttling or carrying those electrons. Poor hydrogen. Hydrogen, it is the source of the electrons, but remember, it's all about electrons. You guys, you wanted to be Jimmy Electron. It's all about electrons. So even though the electron is associated with this hydrogen, they still call this an electron carrier. I'm an electron carrier. I pick up the electrons. I pick up hydrogens. Picking up the hydrogens, carrying the hydrogens over to the Calvin cycle, dropping them off where the Calvin cycle is building them into sugar, swing back around, pick up another one. Okay, and now we're building molecules. So the Calvin cycle is actually building. And remember, to create a chemical bond, you must have energy. And there's the ATP. So that in the light reactions where we said ATP is produced, that ATP is being used right away by the Calvin cycle to add those hydrogens onto the sugar. The ADP swings back around, picks up another phosphate, comes around, and it also is cycling through this. So, photosynthesis. Oops, I'm going wrong there, sorry. All right, so somewhere I'm going the wrong way. Okay, so here's where we will end our thing on photosynthesis. So where does the O2 that you are breathing right now come from? Well, take a deep breath, everybody, and thank a plant. So today, it's a beautiful day outside today. I know we're not supposed to be out there, but it is a beautiful day. So even if you're just looking out through your window and you see a plant, give a nice little bow, thank a plant. All right, remember, I'm a plant physiologist. right, so now let's move on to cellular respiration. So stand up, shake your hands above your head, do a little dance party, whatever you need to do. Know that you just burned about 6 calories. So cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is how you and I are going to get energy from food. So here is that sugar molecule that the plants put together. Here's the oxygen that they didn't need, so they released out into the atmosphere. You and I need both of them. We're going to breathe in this oxygen, eat these plants, and in the process of that, we will strip those hydrogens back off of the sugar molecule. So again, remember conservation of mass. Nothing is magically created or destroyed. It only changes form. So those 6 carbons in the sugar that you're eating will become the carbons in the carbon dioxide that you exhale. The hydrogens that are on that sugar are going to be stripped off. Because remember, when the hydrogen comes off, it takes with it its electrons. And when electrons move, that is energy. So you and I strip those hydrogens off and we put them back onto the oxygen. So those 12 hydrogens are those 12 hydrogens on this side of the equation. So we're going to strip off the hydrogens, place them onto the oxygen we breathe, and in doing so, we make ATP. That ATP will now be used by you and I to carry out all kinds of work. That takes place inside the mitochondria. Remember, the powerhouse of the cell. It happens in both producers and consumers. So remember, plants are not actually making this sugar for you and I. They're making it so that when they need it, they too can undergo cellular respiration. So both plants and animals possess mitochondria, and that mitochondria is working the exact same way in plants as it is in animals. So oxygen is coming in, food coming in, CO2 coming out, water, we can use it in our cells. We also exhale a lot of water as well. So the O2 travels from the lungs to the mitochondria because that's where it's needed. Food travels from the digestive system to the mitochondria because that's where it's needed. The CO2, the byproducts that you and I don't need, they're going to leave the cell and get expelled or released, breathed out through the lungs. So we store our energy in the form of ATP. So this is the molecule that we're talking about making. The mitochondria is capable of taking phosphates that we've already used our energy. So we've broken that third bond of that phosphate, ADP, and it's going to reunite them together. To reunite them together, to make order, to create a chemical bond, means that we must have energy in the system, and that energy is going to come from the foods that you and I eat. So, cellular respiration uses O2 and it burns sugar or glucose. So here's our chemical reaction for it. So you'll want to know this chemical reaction. Again, we track our chemistry. What we don't usually talk about is these things that are not actual. I mean, this is ATP. This is a really important part. This is what you and I are doing. We are utilizing our sugar, breathing our oxygen, and the whole point of it is to make this. I don't need carbon dioxide, don't need the water, therefore I exhale it. This is what we're after. So I'm going to basically break these chemical bonds to form these chemical bonds. And for one sugar molecule, you get anywhere from 36 to 38 ATPs. That's a pretty good payoff.